Once upon a time, there lived a married couple named Obasi and Sandra. After their wedding, they struggled to conceive, enduring 5 years of tears and prayers before finally welcoming their daughter, Zuri. When Zuri was born, they couldn't stop praising God for blessing them after losing hope. One lovely evening, after having dinner and heading to bed, Zuri lay nestled between them. Obasi kept gazing at his little girl, smiling. "What's the reason behind that smile tonight?" Sandra asked, also grinning. "Who would have thought we'd become parents someday? Do you remember all we went through?" Obasi asked. "Can I ever forget? I was labeled barren and ridiculed for 5 years. People whispered as I passed. Different friends gave me advice. Elderly women pulled me aside with their own solutions, and doctors had conflicting opinions. Even at church, some mocked me. A woman once told me to my face that I was a man, which is why I couldn't bear children. I almost ended my life after hearing that," Sandra recalled, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay. That's all in the past now. God gave us Zuri, our little bundle of joy." Obasi reassured her with a smile. "Our daughter will turn 7 next week," Sandra added, smiling. They continued watching Zuri sleep soundly. Then Obasi reached over, turned off the light, and bid his wife good night. The next day, Obasi was so overwhelmed with work that he forgot to pick Zuri up from school. On weekends, it was his responsibility to bring her home. 40 minutes had passed since dismissal, yet Zuri was still waiting. Sandra initially assumed traffic was delaying him, but grew concerned after several minutes and called him. Obasi was stunned to realize how much time had passed and asked his wife to pick Zuri up instead, as he was still busy. Sandra instantly dropped everything and hurried to her daughter's school. She was already 55 minutes late, and the journey took another 15 minutes. She took a bus, but after 5 minutes, heavy traffic stalled her. Realizing a bike would be faster, she got off and searched for one, since bikers could weave through the congestion. After rushing on foot for a while, she hailed a bike, but suddenly remembered she had left her purse on the bus. Sandra hesitated, unsure whether to continue to Zuri's school or retrieve her purse. She told the bike rider to go ahead while she went back for it because her phone was inside. She walked quickly, scanning the area for the bus she had boarded. Meanwhile, back at school, Zuri sat outside with some classmates still waiting for their parents. Others had older siblings who took them home, while some left with their families. Zuri sat in frustration, wondering if her father had forgotten her. "Zuri, your father isn't coming today?" one classmate asked before leaving with her mother. Zuri was weary from waiting. She was starving, having skipped lunch since she disliked the meal her mother packed. Growing impatient, she decided to walk home alone. She left the school carrying her bag and lunchbox. As she walked, her lunchbox suddenly slipped from her grasp and rolled onto the main road. She attempted to retrieve it. A bystander shouted a warning as a speeding car approached. The driver slammed the brakes, but it was too late. Zuri was hit. The driver jumped out of the car immediately and the man saw Zuri lying motionless, bleeding. Before anyone could react, he scooped her into his car, reversed swiftly, and sped away. As Sandra hurried back toward where she had gotten off the bus, she noticed several buses turning around, seeking an alternate route to avoid the congestion. She quickened her steps, trying to spot the bus she had exited earlier, but it was nowhere in sight. It seemed to have left with the others. Sandra clutched her head in distress. Her purse was gone, along with her phone. She wanted to call her husband, but couldn't. She lacked money for a bike as well. Left with no choice, She decided to walk to the school and borrow a phone from a teacher. After minutes of trekking under the scorching sun, Sandra finally reached the school. Standing in front of the school gate, she panted heavily, as though she had just run a marathon. The surroundings were eerily quiet, unlike the usual hustle and bustle of children. Sandra's only hope was that Zuri was still inside, seeing the gate wasn't locked. Just as she reached for the gate, the headmistress emerged, holding a padlock. "Good afternoon, Ma," Sandra greeted, forcing a smile. "Good afternoon, dear. Why are you sweating so much?" the headmistress asked, eyeing Sandra curiously. "I'm sorry for being so late. Has everyone left already?" Sandra inquired, scanning the area. "Yes, it's already 4 p.m. Since it's Friday, we close early," the headmistress responded. "And my daughter?" Sandra's eyes locked onto the headmistress as she secured the gate. "Your daughter? No one is here anymore. Why don't you call your husband and check if he picked her up? He usually comes on Fridays," the headmistress suggested. Sandra's stomach dropped. "I know my husband. He wouldn't have asked me to come if he already picked her up." "Then call him," the headmistress advised. "That's the problem. I can't. I was in such a hurry that I forgot my purse with my phone inside the bus during traffic. My money and phone are both gone. I only wanted to get Zuri first before worrying about my phone. How did you pay for the bus then?" "I had some cash in my hand and just..." "Ma, my phone isn't the issue. Where is my daughter? Where is Zuri?" Sandra's voice trembled with anxiety. "Here, use my phone to call your husband," the headmistress said, pulling it from her bag and handing it to Sandra. Sandra dialed Obasi's number. Obasi answered immediately. Sandra asked if he had picked up Zuri, but his voice faltered. He had been calling her repeatedly, wondering if they had returned home. He was in shock. His princess was missing. "I'm coming now," Obasi said and hung up. Sandra's chest tightened as tears welled in her eyes. "Where is my daughter?" she asked, voice shaking. The headmistress was speechless. She had no answers. Gently, she reassured Sandra and quickly called Zuri's class teacher, instructing her to return to school due to a missing student. Sandra, lost in distress, had no idea where to begin searching for her only child. Tears streamed down her face as she waited anxiously for Zuri's teacher. She paced restlessly, eyes darting around, hoping for a glimpse of Zuri. Minutes later, the teacher arrived at the school. She was asked who had taken Zuri, the teacher called out. Zuri had been sitting outside with her best friend Anita, waiting for her dad. She saw Anita's mother arrive to pick her up, and shortly after, Zuri was nowhere to be seen. The teacher assumed her father had come for her. Sandra urged the teacher to call Anita's mother to check if Zuri had left with them. The teacher scrolled through her contact list, searching for Anita's mother's number when Mr. Obasi jumped off a bike and walked toward them hurriedly. Just then, the headmistress's phone rang. She answered. "Hello, madam. I believe one of your students was in an accident just moments ago," a voice informed her. The headmistress stepped aside to speak more privately and asked for a description of the student. The details matched Zuri. Lowering her phone, she hesitated, unsure of how to break the news to the devastated parents. Even worse, no one knew where she had been taken by the man who had run her over. The headmistress gazed at Obasi, who was trying to console Sandra as she sobbed uncontrollably. It appeared Anita's mother had confirmed Zuri wasn't with them. A single tear welled in the headmistress's eye. She felt helpless and deeply sorry for the couple. Earlier, Zuri had been struck by a speeding vehicle. The man behind the wheel had stepped out immediately upon impact. Seeing the injured child lying motionless, he wasted no time. He gathered her in his arms, reversed his car, and sped off. He prayed desperately that she would survive until they reached a hospital. David had been speaking on the phone with a business partner. He was visiting the city and had been on his way back home. He hadn't noticed Zuri at all, lost in conversation. A sudden, piercing scream jolted him, but before he could react, it was too late. He had already hit the girl. Jumping out of his car, he saw Zuri on the ground. Without hesitation, he picked her up and placed her inside. He refused to take chances with her life. "What kind of trial is this?" David muttered as he raced toward a hospital he remembered from past visits. Sweat dripped from his forehead as he pushed the car to its maximum speed. Upon arrival, David carried Zuri inside. Blood trickled from her mouth and head. It seemed she had struck the front of his Jeep before hitting the ground. The nurses quickly sprang into action. The doctor, occupied with another patient, rushed over once alerted to the emergency. Meanwhile, David paced anxiously, unsure of what to do. The doctor took longer than expected, heightening David's unease. He dreaded receiving bad news. At last, the doctor emerged, his expression grim. David rushed toward him. "How is she?" David asked urgently. The doctor sighed and shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. The impact was severe. After a thorough examination, we discovered internal bleeding in her brain. We've administered medications, but she requires immediate surgery," the doctor explained, his voice serious. "Surgery? Then proceed, doctor. Money is not an issue. I'll sign any necessary documents. Just save her, please," David pleaded, clasping his hands together. "I'm sorry, but we don't have the required medical equipment here. You'll have to transfer her elsewhere. I'll provide written instructions," the doctor responded. David felt lost. He had no idea where to find a well-equipped hospital nearby. He made a snap decision. He would take Zuri to his own city. His priority was her survival. He could locate her parents afterward. David asked if it was safe to drive Zuri 4 to 5 hours to another facility. The doctor approved, provided written notes, and administered another injection before they left. Back at Zuri's school, the headmistress hesitated before softly addressing Mr. Obasi. Both Obasi and Sandra immediately turned, concern evident on their faces. "I just received a call." Sandra's heart sank as she heard the words. My daughter was in an accident? Where? Where did it happen?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. "A few minutes away, down the street," the headmistress replied. Without wasting another second, Sandra took off running toward the location. Mr. Obasi immediately followed her. When they arrived, they were told that the man who had hit Zuri had taken her, possibly to a hospital, but no one knew which one. Without hesitation, the headmistress, the teacher, and the couple hailed a taxi and rushed to the nearest hospital. Inside, the taxi. Mr. Obasi clenched his fists, trying to hold back his emotions. He wanted to lash out, but deep down, he knew the fault was his. Sandra gripped his hand tightly, silent tears streaming down her face. The teacher and headmistress sat, anxiously, hoping they would find Zuri safe and alive. The moment they reached the hospital, Sandra was the first to rush inside. She ran to the reception desk, breathless. "Please, has a little girl in a school uniform? She was in an accident. Has she been brought here?" The nurse checked the records, then shook her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no record of such a case here." Sandra's heart sank, but she didn't give up. They rushed to the next hospital, then the next. By the time they reached the third hospital, Their hopes were wearing thin. But this time, when they asked, a nurse finally nodded. A young girl fitting that description was brought in earlier, she said. Sandra let out a shaky sigh of relief. At last, she would see her only daughter. She could only pray that Zuri was okay. They waited anxiously until a doctor finally walked out. Sandra ran to him. "Doctor, how is my daughter? Where is she? Can I see her?" "Yes, doctor, please." "We need to see her," Mr. Obasi added, his voice desperate. The doctor's expression grew even more serious. "Are you the parents of the little girl?" he asked. "Yes, we are," they both answered at once, nodding urgently. The doctor hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I'm so sorry to tell you this. Your daughter was in a critical accident that nearly took her life. When she was brought here, she was already bleeding badly from her head. At first, I thought it was just an external injury. But after a thorough examination, we discovered internal brain bleeding." Sandra gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "My daughter has internal bleeding? Where is she? I need to see her. Please, doctor," she sobbed. The doctor sighed heavily before continuing. "She needed immediate surgery to stop the bleeding. We gave her medication to slow it down, but our hospital lacks the necessary equipment for the procedure. The man who brought her here, he decided to take Zuri to a bigger hospital in another city for better treatment." Sandra's eyes widened. "Which city? Doctor, do you have his number?" The doctor shook his head. "I'm sorry. I don't know where he took her, and I don't have his contact information." Sandra turned slowly to her husband, her face frozen, in shock. And then she collapsed. The hospital staff rushed to her side, trying to revive her. When Sandra finally regained consciousness, tears poured down her face. Why, God? Why Zuri? After 5 years of praying for a child, why take her? "Away now? Where is my Zuri? Where is she?" she cried, her voice breaking. Mr. Obasi struggled to keep his emotions in check. His little princess, his world, was fighting for her life somewhere out there, and he had no idea where. The headmistress and teacher stood quietly nearby, unable to hold back their own tears. It was getting dark now. They had no choice but to return home. Mr. Obasi turned to Sandra, trying to convince her. Obasi followed his wife home, trying to keep his emotions in check. The headmistress begged him not to take out his anger on the school, assuring him that they would all work together to find Zuri. But Obasi wasn't thinking about the school right now. Blaming them wouldn't bring his daughter back. Deep down, he blamed himself and could only hope that the man who took Zuri would return her safely. Meanwhile, Mr. David was speeding down the highway, desperate to get Zuri the medical attention she needed. When he was stopped by the police, he quickly showed them the medical report and doctor's note. Seeing the urgency, the officers let him pass without further delay. He drove for hours until he finally reached his city. It was already dark, but he wasted no time and headed straight to the hospital. Upon arrival, he handed over the doctor's notes and Zuri was rushed into the operating room. Mr. David immediately took care of the hospital payments while the medical team prepared for surgery. Fortunately, the lead surgeon was still in the hospital, though he had been preparing to leave. It was as if something had held him back. Without wasting another second, he headed into the operating room to attend to Zuri. In the waiting room, Mr. David paced nervously, rubbing his hands together, praying that Zuri would survive. His phone kept vibrating in his pocket. It was his wife, Tina. She had been calling repeatedly, worried about why he hadn't come home yet. Finally, he picked up and explained everything. Shocked, Tina immediately asked for the hospital's location and rushed over. When she arrived, she found her husband sitting anxiously, sweat glistening on his forehead. She sat beside him, holding his hand as he explained everything that had happened. The surgery felt like it was taking forever. Every now and then, a nurse would step out briefly before going back in. The couple sat in the waiting room, drifting, in and out of sleep, their exhaustion mixing with fear. Then, at long last, the doctor emerged, wearing a reassuring smile. Mr. David was the first to react, quickly standing up as Tina woke beside him. "Doctor, how is she? Was the surgery successful?" he asked anxiously. The doctor nodded. "By God's grace, the little girl is safe. The surgery was successful." "Oh, thank God," Mr. David exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. Tina hugged him tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Please, lower your voices," the doctor reminded them softly. Of course, Mr. David said, still overwhelmed with emotion. The doctor continued, "She will need a lot of rest. There's a possibility she may lose part of her memory, but it should return with time. Also, she might have difficulty speaking for a while. I've prescribed some medication. Make sure she takes it as directed. Most importantly, she needs love, care, and patience to recover." Tina's voice was gentle as she asked, "Can we see her now?" "Yes, but please don't disturb her. She needs maximum rest," the doctor advised before walking away. The couple thanked him and immediately entered the hospital room. The moment Tina saw Zuri lying there, she broke down in tears, sobbing uncontrollably. Mr. David wrapped his arms around her, trying to console her. Meanwhile, back at the school, the headmistress left with a heavy heart. She knew Zuri was Obasi's only daughter and could only imagine the pain they were going through. She blamed herself and the teacher on duty for being careless. The class teacher wanted to defend herself, but she knew nothing she said would change the fact that Zuri had gone missing under her watch. She could only pray that the little girl was safe, wherever she was. At home, Obasi wasted no time spreading the word about Zuri's disappearance. He made calls, informing relatives and neighbors about what had happened. He wanted to go to the police station, but he couldn't bring himself to leave Sandra alone in her fragile state. She sat weakly in the living room, staring blankly ahead, as if she had just lost a part of herself. A mother's prayer and a painful past, Sandra sat motionless, lost in her thoughts. She couldn't understand why such a heavy trial had come upon her. She didn't blame her husband. She knew it wasn't intentional. But of all days, why did traffic have to delay her that day? If only there had been no traffic, she might have arrived at the school in time to prevent Zuri's accident. Slowly, she stood up and wiped her tears before making her way to the bedroom. "Where are you going, Sandy?" Obasi asked, watching his wife with concern. Sandra didn't answer. She simply shook her head and kept walking. Entering the bedroom, she knelt beside the bed and clasped her hands together. "Father, I know you won't let anything happen to the only child you've given me. I trust in you, Lord. Wherever Zuri is, whichever hospital she has been taken to, let your healing power be upon her. In Jesus' name, amen." "Amen," Obasi responded, firmly. Sandra turned to see her husband standing behind her. He had followed her into the room, his eyes filled with sorrow. Without a word, he knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her in comfort. Neither of them had the appetite for food. Obasi gently took Sandra to the bathroom and helped her shower, hoping it would ease her distress. Afterward, they lay in bed, but sleep refused to come. Their minds were plagued with endless questions. Who took Zuri? Why did he leave for another city with her without our consent? Is she safe? How will we ever find her? Meanwhile, in another city, Tina was in tears. Seeing Zuri in such a fragile condition was unbearable. She sobbed bitterly, her heart aching for the little girl. Mr. David, worried that her emotions might disturb Zuri's recovery, gently took his wife out of the room. "The doctor said she needs rest, Tina. We can't risk any complications," he reminded her softly. As Tina wiped her tears, memories of her painful past came rushing back. Years ago, when Tina and Mr. David got married, she became pregnant for the first time. The couple was overjoyed, eagerly waiting for their baby's arrival. But just a few weeks later, tragedy struck. Tina had a miscarriage. She wept endlessly, unable to understand what had gone wrong. Determined to try again, she took extra precautions. During her second pregnancy, following every piece of medical advice given to her. Finally, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The couple named him Pascal. He became their greatest joy, their answered prayer. However, their happiness was short-lived. After Pascal's birth, the doctor delivered devastating news. Tina had developed complications that would prevent her from having more children. Though saddened, Tina and Mr. David weren't too worried. They had their beloved son, and that was enough. Pascal grew into an intelligent, well-loved child. He was the pride of his parents. But as time passed, their joy turned into worry. One day, Pascal fell sick. He was taken to the hospital and, after treatment, he recovered. But just a few weeks later, he fell sick again. This pattern continued. He would get sick, receive treatment, recover, and then fall ill again. At first, Mr. David and Tina weren't too alarmed. They had the financial means to buy medicine and ensure he got the best care. But as Pascal's health worsened, he began losing weight rapidly. That was when Tina insisted they take him to another hospital for a more thorough examination. Mr. David agreed, and Pascal was admitted to a different hospital. The doctors conducted several tests, and after hours of waiting, they were called into the doctor's office. The doctor's expression was grim as he delivered the heartbreaking diagnosis. "Your son has leukemia, blood cancer," he revealed gently. In many cases, leukemia in children is treatable, but Pascal's condition has reached a critical stage. "There is nothing more we can do. I'm so sorry. I advise you to spend as much time with him as possible." Tina broke down in tears, sobbing uncontrollably in the doctor's office. With heavy hearts, she and Mr. David went to see their son. When they entered his hospital room, Pascal lay on the bed, his frail body motionless. His once bright eyes now stared at them weakly, filled with silent understanding. A father's determination and a mother's pain, Pascal's tiny hand slowly loosened its grip on his mother's. Tina's heart pounded as she looked down at her son. His bright eyes were dimming, his breathing slowing. "Pascal?" she called out, shaking him gently. But he didn't respond. Realization hit her like a thunderbolt. "No, no, Pascal, wake up! Please, baby, wake up!" she cried, shaking him vigorously. But Pascal was gone. Tears streamed down Mr. David's face as he stood frozen. Watching his wife sob uncontrollably, cradling their son's lifeless body, Tina hugged Pascal tightly, refusing to let go, her cries echoing through the hospital room. Now, sitting beside Zuri, Tina couldn't shake off the memory of losing her son in a hospital bed. The sight of Zuri, wrapped in white hospital clothes, bandages on her small head, made her heart ache even more. With tears in her eyes, she turned to her husband. Who knows? What if she's the only child her parents have, just like us? How will they cope without her? Tina whispered, gripping Mr. David's hand. Mr. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. Tomorrow morning, I'll go back and look for her parents using the name on her school uniform, he said, gently rubbing his wife's back in comfort. Desperate father's search. The next morning, Obasi woke up feeling empty. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, his mind racing with thoughts of his missing daughter. He couldn't sit still any longer. He had to do something. He decided to go to the police station and file a missing person report for Zuri. Just as he was about to leave, his phone rang. It was the proprietor of Zuri's school. Obasi, please. I am so sorry for what happened, she pleaded. I promise we will do everything in our power to help find Zuri. Obasi sighed heavily. He knew she was only calling to save the reputation of her school. He didn't care about apologies. He just wanted his daughter back. Without saying much, he left for the police station. After explaining everything to the officers, they assured him that they would do their best to find Zuri. When he returned home, he considered going to work, but his heart wouldn't let him leave Sandra alone. She needed him. As he approached the house, something felt off. The front door was open. He distinctly remembered asking Sandra to lock it when he left. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Hope in the hospital. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Mr. David returned to Zuri's room with Tina. The little girl still hadn't moved since her surgery. She lay motionless, her breathing slow and steady. The bandage on her head had a small stain of blood. Tina couldn't stop staring at her. She's so beautiful, she whispered, hugging her husband. Yes, she is, Mr. David agreed, smiling faintly. Her parents must be lucky to have her. He glanced at his watch. It was 1:02 a.m. You should go home and rest, my dear. You have work in a few hours, he told Tina. Tina checked her phone and sighed. It was already morning. I wouldn't be able to sleep even if I went home, she admitted. Mr. Quo. David tried to convince her, but she refused. She wanted to stay and watch over Zuri. As the night went on, Tina eventually fell asleep in her husband's lap while he leaned against the wall, exhausted. Morning arrived, and the sounds of hospital activity woke them up. Nurses moved around, doctors made their rounds, and the first rays of sunlight peeked through the hospital windows. The first thing they did was check on Zuri. She was still asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling gently. Mr. David stepped out of the room and found the nurse attending to Zuri. Can I have the uniform she was wearing when she was brought in? He asked. The nurse handed it to him. He took the uniform, carefully folded it, and placed it in the back seat of his car. As he returned to Zuri's room, Tina stood up. She was already running late for work. I have to go, she said, kissing her husband's cheek. Please, take care of her. I will, Mr. David assured her. Before leaving, he handed some money to the nurse. Please, look after her, he said. With that, he turned and walked out of the hospital, ready to find Zuri's family. Will Mr. David find Zuri's parents? Will Obasi and Sandra finally reunite with their daughter? Towards his car, something surprised Mr. David. He had 2 flat tires. He never noticed it when he had come to keep Zuri's uniform. He had just 1 spare tire, so he decided to walk down the road to get help. Few minutes later, Mr. David came back with someone. And his saint was changed. It was time for him to travel back to the city, where he had knocked Zuri down, to look for her parents as Mr. David approached the S-City. Something strange happened. He turned to pick up the uniform, which he had placed perfectly at the back of his car, but to his greatest bewilderment, the uniform wasn't there anymore. Mr. David stepped on his brakes immediately. He decided to clear off. Thayer rode and searched for the uniform. Well, he packed his car and came down. He searched for the uniform, but it was nowhere to be. Music, found. Who do you think hid Zuri's school uniform? Do you think Tina would want Zuri to return to her biological parents? What do you think would be Tina's ulterior motives? We will find out in the next episode. I hope you found the story enjoyable. If you did, be sure to hit the like button, share your thoughts on the lesson from this tale, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more captivating stories like this. Thank you.